I'm Megan.
And I'm Peter.
And today we are talking about an audit of not the PeopleSoft payroll software, but of how King County configured it to pay overtime to corrections officers and paramedics. Our presentation is divided into pay transparency and pay inconsistencies. At a high level, we found that pay stubs are too complex for employees to verify, and that how the county configured PeopleSoft has been altering employee pay since 2012. The financial impact we calculated adds up to about $120,000 per year for these two groups combined, with per employee impacts differing based on the type of work employees did. Some employees benefited more than others. Beyond these two groups of corrections officers and paramedics, other county employees, such as those at Metro Transit and the Department of Natural Resources and Parks, are likely to be affected by these same issues as we found in this audit. Pay stubs help detect payroll errors. State law requires employers to supplement paychecks with pay stubs, which are statements detailing pay information such as hours worked and rates of pay. If pay stubs are organized in a logical, accessible way, these statements allow employees to verify that they are paid correctly and help detect errors that may have been made. In the case of paramedics and corrections officers, we found that pay stubs are generally too complex for employees to be able to verify their pay. In a survey of these employees, we found that 76% of respondents felt their pay stubs were somewhat or extremely difficult to read. So why is it that pay stubs are so hard to read? We found three general reasons. First, bargaining decisions made between union representatives and county negotiators have resulted in complex types of pay for these two groups, which have a lot of overtime and provide county services around the clock 24 hours a day. Second, PeopleSoft presents technical constraints that limit how these new complex pays can be set up in the system. Finally, the county must decide how to configure PeopleSoft in the context of general bargaining decisions and very specific technical constraints. The next two slides will look at the resulting complexity of pay stubs for paramedics and corrections officers, which include unclear descriptions, negative earnings, and multiple pay rates. These complexities effectively make it impossible for employees to verify their pay without additional information. What you see here is the hours and earnings portion of a paramedic's pay stub. The first piece I want to draw your attention to is the description column there on the left. And in particular, these first two items in blue are relatively straightforward. They refer to regular earnings and vacation. However, highlighted in orange, you'll see there are some descriptions that are less clear. For example, at the bottom of this pay stub and in the middle, where a parenthetical notation is actually cut off, making paramedics wonder what it is that they aren't seeing in the description line. So the second issue I want to show besides descriptions is negative earnings. And here, even easy to understand descriptors like regular earnings become confusing because they're not adding to pay but subtracting from it, and making paramedics and corrections officers who also see negative earnings wonder if they're being paid as much as they should be. So this slide shows one other pay stub, and this one is for a corrections officer. The main issue I want to highlight here is the rate column, which is second from the left. Here you'll notice that every single one of these rates is different. Only one of the rates in the middle, the one here labeled as regular earnings, would be recognizable by an employee as their hourly base rate. The other rates are variable, meaning they'll change from pay stub to pay stub and are determined on a weekly basis by the Federal Fair Labor Standards Act, which Peter will talk a little bit more about, and sets the floor for the acceptable amount of overtime pay. Employees would need more information to know how PeopleSoft computes these rates, and they currently only get the information if they call their payroll staff and have them run a query. So understanding the accuracy and transparency of FLSA overtime rates was one of the main objectives of our audit. Based on these issues, we recommend that the Department of Public Health and the Department of Adult and Juvenile Detention proactively provide information to employees that clearly explains the rates of pay that appear on their pay stubs, as well as when and why they would have negative earnings. Similarly, we recommend that the Department of Executive Services provide employees with information on pay descriptions that are in terms that employees understand. Now on to Peter to talk about pay inconsistencies and how a lack of transparency in 2012 make it even more difficult for employees to understand how their pay is calculated.
Thank you, Megan. Even if their pay stubs were easy to understand, these employees would still not be able to verify that their paychecks are accurate because some decisions about how to calculate overtime pay were not made transparently. In general, labor contracts lay out how to calculate overtime pay for each bargaining group. In addition, there are minimum requirements in state and federal law, most notably the Fair Labor Standards Act, or FLSA. Prior to 2012, the county could not accurately calculate FLSA overtime requirements, which is one reason it transitioned to PeopleSoft. In 2012, the county set up PeopleSoft to calculate FLSA overtime pay at higher amounts than required by federal law, labor contracts, or practice at that time. The Department of Executive Services did not provide documentation that would explain why it would calculate FLSA rates differently than required by FLSA law. When these issues increased overtime pay, DES states that these were not errors but intentional decisions. However, when similar issues resulted in overtime rates that are lower than the FLSA allows, then DES agreed that those configuration decisions were in fact errors. Whether these issues were originally errors or decisions, they have been in place for over 7 years, so they might now be considered a past practice and require additional bargaining to change. In our audit, we quantified the impact of the decisions made in 2012 that systematically inflated overtime pay. The bars on this chart represent each of the 632 corrections officers and paramedics we analyzed. The impact of these overtime issues is represented by the height of the bar, which shows how much more the employee was paid over an 8-month period beginning in October 2018. We chose this particular period to correspond with the paramedics' shift to biweekly pay. As you can see, these issues affected employees very differently. These differences are based on how much overtime each employee worked, what types of shifts they worked, and what premiums they happened to earn. For example, the net impact was less than $1 for about 140 of these employees. On the other end of the spectrum, pay increased by at least $100 for 194 employees. At the extreme, 2 employees had pay increases by more than $1,500 each during this 8-month period. We also found that 1 employee was underpaid by over $300, but we determined that this was due to a one-off data entry error, not the systemic issues impacting other employees. In total, the net impact was around $80,000 for these 2 groups over 8 months. We estimate it would therefore be around $120,000 for a full year for these 2 groups, potentially dating back to 2012. In addition, these same systemic issues might also impact other bargaining groups that use overtime, but who are outside the scope of this audit. The issues we identified are highly technical and difficult to summarize. Appendix 2 of our report has more details on specific issues. In short, the issues fell into 3 broad categories: configuration issues, approach issues, and data entry errors. First, We found issues with the software configuration for around 40% of the earnings codes we reviewed. These were treating the same types of pay differently when calculating FLSA overtime rates, without any rationale for the different treatment. Second, we found the county's approach to applying FLSA rates paid these rates even when it didn't need to under the law. These FLSA rates are generally higher than the overtime rates bargained for in labor contracts, so deciding to use them inflated overtime pay more than required by the law, labor contracts, or practices prior to 2012. Finally, we found a few one-off data entry errors. These usually had small impact on pay, with the exception of the one employee I mentioned earlier who was underpaid by over $300. Therefore, we recommended that DES review earnings codes, make changes necessary to ensure internally consistent logic and legal compliance, and document how codes align with law and past practice. Many of the earnings codes in use today were set up in 2012, but new codes are created when bargaining results in new types of pay. We found that DES has few controls in place to ensure that new codes are created consistently. An accurate payroll system requires an understanding of the legal language in both the FLSA and in labor contracts, as well as an understanding of how to configure the PeopleSoft software to reflect these legal requirements. We found siloed knowledge and unclear responsibilities over key steps in the pay process. For example, the prosecuting attorney's office is the main point of contact for federal law, while the Office of Labor Relations knows contract language and bargaining intent. Inside DES, the Business Resource Center is responsible for configuring and supporting the PeopleSoft system. The overall process owner is the Benefits, Payroll, and Retirement Options section inside of DES. This is known as BPROS. However, there is unclear responsibility for translating legal requirements into the programmatic logic of the PeopleSoft system, and in turn, unclear responsibilities for confirming that the programming logic aligns with the law. This allows pay issues to continue to come up as new requirements are bargained and new codes are introduced into the system. Therefore, we recommend that DES clarify responsibility for payroll accuracy, from bargaining to final implementation, develop standard operating procedures for implementing pay decisions, and bolster the quality assurance process. The county executive has concurred with all of our recommendations. This concludes our presentation, but our full report is available online at our website. This has been Peter Heineccius
and Megan Coe
for the King County Auditor's Office.